Hello! In this video, I'm going to use my trusty Moog Matriarch to recreate a common filterized stomper bass. For this type of modern sound, I usually use a software synth like this. But I wanted to see how the Matriarch's beautiful analog character and warmth would stack up to the convenience and power of a software synth. So let's have a listen to what we're trying to recreate. This is a patch I made in Serum. Cool, that sounded pretty sweet, but before we get to the Matriarch, let's take a look at Serum. Serum is a great software wavetable synth. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, just want to talk about the relative parameters in relation to the patch we're going to create on the Matriarch. So let's hear the patch. We got two oscillators in the patch, just going to turn off the second one and the filter so we can just hear oscillator 1. It's a saw wave with an LFO modulating the wavetable position. Oscillator 2 is the same thing, but it's just a different shaped saw. We've got a 12 dB bandpass filter, which is being modulated by a ramp. The LFO is key triggered. It's obviously how we're getting our rise. Okay, I'm going to initialize the patch. Let's hear it. Software synth's obvious advantage is the number of voices. We can go to 16 on this thing. Yeah, that's nuts. You can't do that on the Matriarch. The other thing that is super cool is in the filter, let's just hear that. It's just low pass filter at the moment. We have a mix control. So we can get wet and dry parallel filter processing with this. That's super cool. Yeah, that's awesome. I just love that sound. Okay, back to the Matriarch. So the biggest drawback, of course, is the number of voices, so we're going to make do with 4 instead of 32. Let's put the Matriarch in unison mode and amp envelope mode on the VCA, and we're switching all our oscillators to saws, and we'll go to about 10 o'clock for each oscillator on the mixer. That's still pretty big. Might not be 32 voice big, but it's still pretty big. Okay, let's get the amp envelope going so it brings sustain down to 0 and decay and release up a little bit. We want it to be punchy with a little bit of release. Now I'm going to go into global settings, and you know what, actually, first we're just going to load default settings because I haven't done that in a while and I don't know what I've got going on. So back into global settings, and this isn't working. So sometimes if you have a one key command, you've got to push that high A sharp to get it go. Okay, now we're into pitch variance. So A sharp 0, I'm going to try G2 first. So what this does is it turns your Matriarch into a synth from the 70s, one that doesn't key track very well and plays a little bit out of tune. On modern synths we call it oscillator slop, but you know what? We can make it a little sloppier. That's not why it's called slop. I'm going to try C3. Yep, that's sloppy. Pitch variance is basically random detuning, that's it. It will act as my substitution for the wavetable modulation that was on Serum. It's not the same sound, but it's a good way to get some movement. Next, we've got to set up the bandpass filter. It's super easy. We're just going to put the filter in series mode, the cutoff at around 12 o'clock and spacing at 12 for now to start. Add a little bit of envelope modulation. Cool, that's a nice sounding bandpass. Now in Serum I had the bandpass filter being modulated by a key triggered ramp LFO, so let's set that up. And we're going to patch wave out First set this to ramp, I guess, into an attenuator. The attenuator obviously controls the amount of modulation, and then out of attenuator 2 into the cutoff of VCF1. The ins and outs of these two attenuators are normaled, so if you don't patch anything in there, attenuator 2 acts as an offset. So attenuator 1 controls the amount of modulation, and attenuator 2 is now a DC offset for the LFO. So in plain English, I'm able to control the starting voltage of the LFO. So let me demonstrate that. Have a listen to what happens when I change the attenuator value. No offset. And raised offset. Now in this case we'd get pretty much the same effect by just playing with the cutoff knob, so it frees that knob up so we can play with it in real time without altering our modulation. To sync that LFO to the keyboard so it re-triggers with the key press, patch keyboard out into sync in. You can hear it and you can even see it on the little blinking light. Cool, that worked great. We don't have 32 oscillators, but we do have an LFO not in use, so let's try it out as a sub oscillator. Just so I can tune it, I'm going to turn off all the oscillators in the mixer first, and I'm going to patch out of the back of the Matriarch the keyboard CV out into the rate input on our LFO. That's so we can key track the oscillator. And we'll take, let's use the triangle LFO. We're going to patch that into VCA 1 in. And I'm using a passive attenuator as a volume control here. Turn the rate up to get to audio range. There we go. And we're going to tune it using the rate knob. And this can be a giant pain in the butt. I'm trying to tune it to a C, which I'm pressing on the keyboard. I've got this oscillator patched directly in the VCA to try to simulate that parallel wet-dry filter processing. I'm patching out of my Matriarch into my console just as usual, using two cables left and right. But I've got both channels centered in the mix. And I'll use the attenuator to control the volume of the left side. Again, the reason I'm doing this is to have one voice bypass the filter so I can have a blend of filtered and dry oscillators like the patch in Serum. Another way to do this is we could patch all the wave outs of all the oscillators into a mult. Well, we need two mults actually. Then into an attenuator, could be on the Matriarch or external. And then into a VCA input. That way you'd have a dry-wet blend of all the oscillators and not just the sub. I would have done that if I had thought about it while I filmed this, but I did it afterwards, and this is what it sounds like. That sounds really cool, but let's get back to our patch. One thing I forgot to mention, in the Serum patch, I used noise to add a little bit of air or brightness to the sound. But we don't want it to muddy up the low end, so we're going to filter it. So back into global settings, and we're going to hit F#1 to turn on our noise filter. So it's an internal high-pass filter, and I really want to get rid of those lows, so I'm going to go pretty high on the keyboard. Okay, let's see what that sounds like. Let's turn up the noise in the mixer. Oh, that's pretty good. Almost no lows in the noise now. It's just adding a little sizzle, a little brightness. And I think I'm going to put two of these oscillators up the octave, or even 2 octaves, just to get a little thicker sound. And I'll add a little bit more of our dry sub. Okay, but we've lost a little bit of our modulation, so let's play with the cutoff and the offset. There we go. Now, one other thing I forgot is in the Serum patch, I used chorus. I did a video a couple weeks ago about using the Matriarch's delay as a chorus. We could, of course, just use a chorus pedal, but why don't we try this out? So this is a simplified version of the patch I did before, but what we're going to do is patch the LFO out into a mult and back into our attenuator, so it's still acting as a sub oscillator. Out of the mult into an attenuator, and into the attenuator into the delay time input, or CV time input for the delay. All right, we'll turn up the delay in the mix. Make sure your delay time is set to its fastest speed. And if we modulate this attenuator, we'll get, there we go, a little bit of chorusing effect. It's not quite as good as the other patch, but it's working. So we need to modulate the CV input of the attenuator. We're out of LFO, so I'm going to try the sample and hold and see what that sounds like. Okay, it's working. It's kind of a weird sound, but its own unique, strange chorus. I think we need a couple of little adjustments here, and it might be even better. With the amp sustain at 0, you have to be conscious of how you perform this patch. If I press and hold a key, listen to what happens. And if I strike and release, the amp envelope release is triggered and I'm getting a longer decay. Cool, I like that. Now if we want a more aggressive sound, we can switch our sub oscillator to a square wave. Let's check that out. Yeah, that's a big difference. Now check this out. If you play with the amp sustain, we can get some really cool modulation happening. Now, if you put the release on the amp up really high, we're going to get pretty much a fake delay. Cool. In firmware update 1.23, which I think is one back, Moog added the ability for the keyboard and sequence out jacks to mirror each other. Unfortunately, in the latest firmware update 1.3, this is a little buggy. The keyboard gate out always mirrors the sequence gate. If they fix this by the time you're watching this video, you'll need to set the keyboard out to mirror the sequencer, or just simply patch the sequencer gate out into the sync in on the mod bay. But because the bug is still active, I don't have to do anything to get the LFO to sync with the sequencer. So let's play with the sequencer. Cool, that's about it for this patch. Hope you learned something. Thanks for watching.